Wow, thank you. Thank you so much. I am honored to be invited to speak to you all and to converse and discuss and learn together. And so I'm really looking forward to our time. Challenges during the pandemic. Here are just a couple listed here on the slide that adolescents reported in a qualitative study: mental and physical health, issues around social connection and community, missing important events, having routines disrupted, financial, socioeconomic issues, rules adherence, contraction exposure to COVID, technology issues, worries about their future plans, and worries about academics. And these are just a few. We could probably spend the full hour really just unpacking all of this. But for today, I wanted to focus on academics. And on what stood out to me from this study by Scott et al. In the Journal of Adolescent Health was that academics was actually the number one reason, the number one worry students cited when they thought about their experience during the pandemic. And one student shared that they were worried about trying to stay motivated with school, and that characterized about a quarter of the adolescents that participated in this study. So motivation, right, on top of all of these worries that affected our whole entire world, academics and motivation rose to the top. So why motivation? Why focus on motivation? Well, a brief definition first. It's the process whereby goal-directed activity is instigated and sustained. And that comes from Shunk and colleagues. And it's a broad definition, but it captures what the focus of this presentation will be, right? How students are academically motivated. And why focus on motivation? Well, it's a powerful determinant for achievement and academic performance. One example is a meta-analysis that I recently conducted with the help of many dutiful doctoral students. We meta-analyzed over 150 studies looking at students' learning and study strategies. And we found that amongst 10 strategies that we looked at, strategies around mitigating anxiety, concentration strategies, information processing strategies, self-testing, time management, what came to the top was motivation strategies, strategies around goal setting, strategies around exerting effort and maintaining interest in learning. These were the most highly correlated strategies when it came to students' GPA and grades, as well as their course persistence. So you see that in this quick little snapshot here, that amongst the 10 strategies we looked at, motivation really came out on top. Something else to consider, and Amanda alluded to this earlier in the introduction, that motivation isn't a unitary construct that, someone is motivated or someone is unmotivated. Motivation is really, really complex, and scholars have spent the last century trying to unpack motivation, trying to classify different types of motivation and uncover the various processes that students engage in when they're motivated to learn. And so it's a very complex endeavor. And so to kind of take a deep dive into some of that, I wanted to provide a quick overview of motivation theories. And by no means is this an exhaustive treatment of these really deep and complex theories, but I just really want to get at the motivational mechanism, I think, behind each of these theories and like the crux of all of them. So we can walk away with kind of a bird's eye view of some of the theoretical constructs that might come into play when thinking about student motivation. So the 5 theories are self-determination, attribution theory, social cognitive theory, situated expectancy value theory, and goal orientation theory. And I'll walk you through each of these fairly briefly. So self-determination theory focuses on how students feel like they're self-determined, like they are in the origin of their own behavior and actions. And what really helps to satisfy this type of motivation are three basic psychological needs. And often environments and factors can either satisfy these needs or thwart these needs. And the three needs are competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Competence is like what it looks like is whether you feel like you are capable of meeting the demands of a certain task. Autonomy is whether you're at the origin of your actions and you're not pressured or feeling like there's some external force maybe directing you in your behavior. And then relatedness is simply sense of belonging, whether they feel connected to important others. I told you this was going to be quick. Attribution theory, right? What is the main motivational crux here? Well, it's how individuals identify what's behind their outcomes, what's behind a successful outcome, maybe a not so successful outcome. Researchers have shown that there are different types of causes that students and individuals can attribute their success or failure to. Some of these dimensions are an internal dimension, whether it's a factor from within, maybe it's a factor external from the individual. Maybe that factor is controllable. There's something that can be done within one's control, or it's something kind of out of someone's purview. And maybe that factor is stable. It's really hard to change and it's consistent over time, or it's something that's malleable and unstable. These reasons give rise to various emotions and various motivated perceptions and behavior, because that's going to figure out, okay, what am I going to do next, right? If I can control things, if something's within my control, then maybe there's something I can do. Or if something's not, then it's going to just kind of lead to helplessness. The third theory, and Amanda already gave a plug for a kind of a social cognitive framework here, is this interaction, right? That it's not just the individual by themselves, but it's a reciprocal interaction, right? Between the individual's perceptions and their behavior and the environment. So this is kind of an overarching framework that a lot of psychologists use. And with social cognitive theory as applied to education, a really important perception is one of self-efficacy, the belief that one is capable of executing a task. And one kind of sub-theory within social cognitive theory is what are the determinants of one's self-efficacy, one's kind of academic confidence. And there are four theorized sources. The first one being mastery experiences, your prior successes and failures that are going to inform whether I'm going to be successful in the future. Vicarious experiences, seeing similar others. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a classmate who's similar to maybe your background, and you see if they're doing well or doing not so well. That's going to also inform your self-efficacy. Social persuasions, those are the verbal messages you might receive from peers or instructors that's going to inform your own self-beliefs. And then the affective, or sometimes called physiological experiences, probably the most prominent being one of anxiety. If you're anxious, you're probably not going to be feeling the most confident to engage in that task. Whirlwind tour, two more theories left. Situated expectancy value theory. And briefly, this is a complex theory, but I think a lot of it can be boiled down to how students' achievement choices are informed by three categories of perceptions. The first one, expectancies, kind of similar to self-efficacy. But the second, task value, can be thought of as three different flavors of task value, right? One's intrinsic value, where you're interested, you enjoy the topic inherently for the task itself. Attainment task value means that it's a task that's personally meaningful to you or personally relevant to your personal or social identities. And then there's utility task value, where you see the value as being useful for your future, for a future goal, a future course, or a future career. The third category of perceptions are cost perceptions. Those refer to maybe psychological cost, emotional costs, opportunity costs, the things that you may have to give up in order to engage in this task. And so maybe the negative sides of engaging in an academic assignment or an academic pathway. So these three categories of perceptions work together to inform students' achievement choices. And there's a lot of other complex factors here, things like the role of socializing agents, family, teachers, right? These people who may inform these perceptions towards achievement choices. And last but not least, goal orientation theory. And this theory is premised on the idea that students have a meaning system that they are creating. And it's often derived from attaining two types of broad goals. These broad goals are, one, goals towards mastery, where you're trying to develop competence and pursue learning, versus performance goals, which instead of developing competence, you might be more focused on demonstrating competence, trying to maybe outcompete your peers or impress important others. And that may be the driving goal you may have. Definitely not mutually exclusive. I think students often hold both of these, and how they interpret these goals to inform a larger meaning system in their academic journeys. So you just got a 7-minute summary of a motivation course, but hopefully these constructs give a rough framework on some of the important factors when it comes to considering students' motivation. There's a lot here. It's multidimensional, it's complex, it's different constructs. And so we're going to try to kind of unpack some of these in light of the last 2 years, in light of the pandemic learning experiences students have had. And so, so to do so, I have kind of conceived of students' experiences or COVID-related shifts in students' worlds that I've observed in my own life, in my students' lives, in the literature. And they are roughly categorized into these 4 groups. And obviously there's a lot of overlap kind of between these 4 groups as well, but they are instructional shifts, social shifts, future-oriented shifts, and what I'm calling racial, social, cultural shifts. So I want to go through each one of these, kind of unpack what I mean by each of these 4 categories, and then turn to what Amanda introduced, the impacts of these shifts on students' motivation. And I'll be bringing in some of the relevant studies on this topic, as well as some theoretical implications as well. So perhaps the most obvious, I think most of us on a college campus know that instructional shifts was probably one of the most felt disruptions. The sudden move to remote instruction caused students to grapple with new forms of technology, with different modalities of learning than what they were probably expecting. Modified forms of assessment, perhaps more online examinations or electronic tests, things like that. Hands-on learning, I think, really got hampered, thinking about labs in STEM, thinking about the fine arts, right? A suspension of a lot of these in-person hands-on learning experiences. I think the instructional shifts, I think we're all too familiar with. Let's take a deeper look now on how the instructional shift of the remote move to learning may impact students' motivation. And I think across the board in a lot of different studies, we've seen lowered students' academic self-efficacy. We could kind of put the lens of those sources that we discussed earlier kind of into this, right? Students didn't have mastery experiences online. Some of them may have never engaged in online learning or had maybe limited experiences with that. So they're not starting off with a good base of how do I engage effectively and adaptively online as I learn. Because of the lack of in-person interaction, maybe there's also limited vicarious experiences where they're interacting with their peers and seeing similar others engage with the online learning as well. And maybe there's also a reduction in those verbal encouragements that they might get from peers or instructors that may come more naturally in person. And then I think across the board, there's just been increased anxiety over many, many things. And so that in turn will also impact academic self-efficacy. But primary studies also show this as well. Hilpert et al., looking at about 200 undergraduate students in biology, found a decrease in academic self-efficacy over the course of the spring 2020 semester, time 1 being at the beginning of the semester, time 2 being a week after the shift to remote instruction, and time 3 being at the end of the semester. And so we see a steady decline in students' academic confidence as they're moving through the shift to virtual learning. We also see effects on student autonomy, students' sense of, okay, I'm in control, I'm in the origin of my actions and behavior. And I think on one hand, we see autonomy being thwarted because of the kind of mandated move to go online. And Hensley et al. Did a pretty in-depth qualitative study with a lot of undergraduates, and had 2 students and reported 2 students sharing this. I have zero motivation for online classes. That's why I don't sign up for them. I don't have the self-accountability to do my coursework. Second, the whole reason I went to college in person was to be motivated. Virtual learning is not beneficial to me. And so we see here that these students didn't choose it. And so their autonomy, might be reduced because, hey, this is being mandated on me, and this is not what I would have preferred. In the same vein, instructors might also be, inadvertently teaching in more controlling styles when experiencing burnout. And there's been some really fascinating research showing when teachers are stressed, when they're under duress or experiencing burnout, like the majority of all of us have over the last 2 years, those are going to lead to more controlling teaching styles. And that in turn will also reduce students' autonomy, because the way we teach might be more focused on teacher expectations, or focused on what teachers want to do, versus thinking about, okay, how can students have autonomy in learning? So more controlling teaching styles can also thwart students' autonomy. And I'm guilty of that too. I think we're all really experiencing high levels of burnout over the last 2 years. But I said there's mixed findings because I also think the pandemic may have positively influenced students' autonomy in some cases. I think there were potential opportunities for students to make instructional choices. I think with a lot of asynchronous options, students may have had the choice to, okay, how am I going to engage in this class? Like maybe there's a project that I can invest personal effort in that can foster the sense that students are kind of in control of their learning. And so I maybe more so in the K-12 realm, where I think there was a lot of asynchronous time and a lot of free discretion for students. But I think also in higher ed, the way classes may have been structured, some of that offline time could have been more self-directed. Okay, so that was the first shift, instructional shifts. The second one I want to focus on is social shifts. And I think the loss of in-person relatedness has been palpably felt over the last 2 years now. The reduced influence of socializing agents, the role of the instructor, the role of peers. I think we can't underemphasize that when it comes to student motivation. And I think hand in hand in that as well goes with the declines in mental health that we have seen so rampantly over the last 2 years as well. So thinking about the social shifts, how do you think those translate into effects of motivation? And I also think there's a mixed picture here as well. I think definitely lower autonomous motivation. It's clear that when people do not feel like they belong or feel like their relatedness is being thwarted, it's going to lower their academic motivation. And Marler found that in a study with also close to 200 undergraduates. But what was interesting in this study was they also controlled for students' beliefs of online learning. So they measured whether students thought like online learning was worthwhile and was good for them. But across the board, they found that even if you liked online learning or you didn't like online learning, belonging still had a negative association with academic motivation. So I think across the board, we all kind of felt the demotivating effects of that lack of connection that we're facing as instructors, and I think as students for sure. And then the declines in mental health have also been shown to be linked with lower motivation as well. So if you're struggling with anxiety or depression, right, those are also going to have real impacts on how motivated you are to engage in academic activities as well. But I think one silver lining, there's been work that has shown that relatedness supportive virtual interactions. And so I think during the pandemic, when students were able to engage proactively and adaptively where relatedness needs were being met through virtual interactions. So students were reporting that they were still able to share concerns with others via virtual interaction. Those activities were actually associated with pleasant emotions and higher motivations. So, so despite the lack of connection in person, I think if students were able to kind of adaptively cope with high relatedness virtual interactions, those students were, I think, buffered from some of the potential negative consequences of the social shifts during the pandemic. 2 more shifts, and then we'll do a little chat break. Future-oriented shifts. I think the bleak economic outlook caused by the pandemic really resonated with students. I think also seeing the heroism in the healthcare and the medical fields, I think that also struck a motivational chord with students. But also across the board, there's just been kind of a blanket sense of academic boredom and disengagement, especially with the virtual learning platforms. And so, so all of this is a complicated mix, but I think we could kind of turn to maybe some of the motivational constructs to help us kind of disentangle maybe how students are seeing their futures. So how have maybe future-oriented shifts influenced student motivation? I think the research has shown that there have been declines in how students have valued their academic tasks and maybe their goals for mastery. And so turning to that Hilpert et al. Study, it's just, it's all downward curves in that study. It's just like down, down, down. Once again, pre-shift to virtual learning, right after virtual learning, and right at the end of that spring 2020 semester, we see a decrease in just utility value on the slide there, but we see similar patterns with attainment value and with intrinsic value. And we also see similar findings with mastery goals as well. So students are kind of less curious or less willing to develop competence as a result of these shifts. And so I highlight utility value in particular, because I think this has direct connection with how they're seeing their future, right? Maybe with a bleak economic outlook, with uncertainty about employment opportunities, they're like, oh man, like I'm not even seeing like the connection with what I'm learning to how useful it might be for my future. So to me, that was worth noting and worth noting to be concerned about. While value and mastery goals are declining, we see an increase in perceptions of cost. And one qualitative study that one of my doctoral students is conducting, she asked STEM majors, how has the COVID pandemic affected your pursuit of STEM? One student shared that, well, because my lab classes aren't being offered, I need to stay an extra year now if I want to keep my STEM major. And so we see a clear just example of an opportunity cost there. Like, wow, am I going to pay an extra year of tuition, delay my graduation because I want to maintain my STEM degree plan, right? And so we see this increase in cost both quantitatively in these survey studies, but I think also qualitatively as well. On the flip side, I think we also see renewed interests in STEM and medicine for some individuals, right? It's not across the board that that interest is waning, but I think we also see some interest in particularly STEM medicine fields. That study I referenced with my doctoral student, she looked at 152 Latinx undergraduates. And there's just one quote here that says, "I think COVID has positively impacted my decision to continue with my STEM degree so that one day I can become a medical professional. It has motivated me and pushed me into being a stronger person." So perhaps seeing the heroism, seeing the role models, seeing the societal impact our healthcare workers and scientists have contributed to over the last 2 years have forged interest in this area. And so once again, kind of a mixed picture here, but things to consider as we see kind of these dueling kind of directions here. It's like, on one hand, people are losing interest, but on the other hand, there's some sparks of other interest. And so we really have to understand that deeply. And then the last shift has been racial and social cultural in nature. And I think in addition to the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we've been newly grappling with the pandemic of racism. And I think a few instances of this, the growing racial disparities in healthcare, the highly visible tragedies just over the last 2 years linked with police brutality and racial violence. And we've also seen heightened prejudice and violence against Asian Pacific Islander and Desi American individuals. And so I think all of these combined together have also impacted the way students are motivated in learning, maybe indirectly, but I think there's still some important influences to unpack. And so one thing I wanted to discuss is, I think because of some of the racial disparities in healthcare and just kind of this heightened awareness of racism in our society, I think there's also been maybe, once again, some silver lining here, that there's increased pro-social motivation aligned with community or society-oriented values. Cromley and Coons looked at some qualitative data as well as some survey data. But one qualitative quote that stood out to me was, "The fact that I get to achieve my dreams of becoming a doctor and helping to end disparities within the healthcare system is what motivates me every day to try my hardest in this course." And so to me, that quote really captures, I think, some of these positive motivational responses to the racial and social cultural shifts we've seen. But once again, I'm kind of presenting a mixed picture here because it's also clear from research studies that experiencing oppression and structural disadvantaging, those are going to decrease student motivation, right? When students may see that, man, the system is not really going in my favor, it can dampen their motivational pursuits. On the other side of that coin, there might be opportunities for motivational resilience to exhibit almost a resistant motivation to show that, okay, I know that there are disparities and there are structural barriers in the way, but all the more I'm going to succeed, right? And so we also see kind of a little bit of this counter narrative as well. And so once again, a complex picture, but we do see, I think, impacts on student motivation experiencing these shifts. So we talked through 4 shifts right now: instructional, social, future-oriented, and social, cultural, racial. And so I think on the chat, which one of those shifts do you think you've experienced the most, or maybe you've experienced your students having the most challenge with? And so maybe we'll just do a quick chat break. Which of those 4: instructional, social, future-oriented, and social cultural? Okay. Seeing some chats come in. Yeah, all of them. I like, for sure. Yeah, depends on the student. I think each student has had a unique set of circumstances and a unique set of experiences with all of these, for sure. So keep those coming on the chat as you consider some of these shifts in your own experiences and interactions with students. But what now, right? What now? I think many may say we're post-pandemic. Some may disagree, but I think what we can determine, what we can conclude from the literature is that over the last 2 years, students' motivation overall is probably at its lowest, right? Students' academic self-efficacy, students' sense of belonging, students' mental health, their sense of autonomy and interest, they're probably not doing so well in all of those areas. I also included a few studies in the last few slides about high school students, because in 2 years, they're the ones that are entering freshmen on our campuses, right? And they too have experienced all of these shifts and maybe even more as high school students, right? But now they're the incoming class of what, 2027, right? And so so these are students that we're going to be teaching and supporting in our classrooms this coming fall. So so what now? How can we take a look at these shifts that they've experienced, take a look at the impacts, both positive and negative, on their motivation, and think about relevant supports moving forward? And so to do so, I went ahead and kind of integrated across everything I just shared. And so this table is really small, so do not worry. But what I did was I took the 4 shifts that we just went through, and then I crosswalked that with the 5 theories that I introduced earlier today. And then I kind of synthesized together to form what I'm hoping is kind of an integrative model that can help both scholars and, I think, professors, instructors, practitioners, supporting socializers to think about students' motivation. And so I've broken it down by kind of temporal sequence, right? It's important to consider what has happened in students' past and in their backgrounds, and what's going on in the present, and looking forward, like what are students' conceptions of their future like. Really briefly, I'm going to focus on the present. So I'm going to go through the past and the future rather quickly, but I think what's important to consider about students' past is they're forming what I'm calling like a motivational schemata, like their lens in which they're gonna experience their future motivation is gonna be really affected by all the other things they've experienced, right? Whether it's how their identities have been formed, whether personal or collective identities informed by their family and communities, the culture and the context in which they grew up, both historically and currently, right? How did that inform their outlook? What I'm calling socialization capital, right? Kind of the socializers that have shaped their lives, right? How have those translated into kind of assets that they have as they think about their academic journeys, and then also their prior successes and failures, right? They're going to be carrying those kind of mastery experiences and maybe the attributions for those successes and failures with them as they engage academically in our campus spaces. So I want to spend more time in the changing context, right? The present that we're in. And it's not just pandemic motivation anymore, right? I think what the goal of this model is to think students are always in transition, right? They're not just transitioning from remote to in-person or in-person to remote. Like they're always experiencing challenges, difficulties maybe in transitioning to a new environment, to a new semester, to a new chapter in their life, to a new set of circumstances that caught them off guard, right? There's always going to be changing contexts. And I think the 4 shifts, pandemic or not, or post or not, like it's still going to be relevant, right? There might be changes in how they experience instruction, right? There might be changes in how they're viewing their future, changes in racial dynamics, changes in their social worlds, right? And so, so taking it beyond now just what we've covered the last 2 years and the impacts there, I think we can broaden and look at these shifts and look at how motivation is still relevant, and perhaps motivation can help anchor students as they're experiencing some of these transitions. So the 4 motivational kind of categories I want to focus now in this model, there's a lot of overlap with the theories, but I kind of wanted to break it down to just focus on 4. The first one being autonomy and agency, right? Students feel like they're in control, that feel like they have agentic engagement in what they're learning, right? That they can kind of insert their own self into the learning process. I think that's going to be a key factor. Competence, but I'm kind of reframing it as asset-based competence, because it's not just the academic skills they might be learning, but also the various assets they're bringing from their past, right? And seeing those as useful in their current environment as competencies that they can actually leverage towards their academics. Both personal and collective task values, right? I think we saw like a rise in pro-social motivation over the last 2 years. So really seeing collective and societal values also dovetailing with students' personal values of, you know, is this important? Is this interesting? Is this useful? And then last but not least, sense of belonging, right? And I think through these 4 categories of motivation, we can think about targeting them, think about fostering these 4, which we'll turn to next. But really quickly, we can't ignore the future where students are headed. And I think some things to consider for students' futures are, what are their goals, right? What are their personal goals? What are their collective goals? Perhaps representing goals from their family or goals from their communities. Their conceptions of meaning, right? Goal orientation theory in its broadest sense is to create a meaning system, right? So what is ultimately going to be meaningful for students as they think about their future and their purpose? But also situating this in the opportunity structures that are available to students, right? We know that it is not equitable across the board for students. And so I think students are thinking about their future and thinking about, okay, what are the opportunity structures and what are ways in which there are barriers or maybe there are disadvantages in the opportunity structures available to me. So as a whole, past, present, future, once again, I want us to focus on the future, focus on the present, sorry, because I think this is where we're at, right? This is where we can really intervene, where we can really interject some practical teaching strategies and practical messaging and practical strategies to create environments that really foster, I think, these 4 categories. And so to do so, I'm going to highlight 4 approaches. And oh gosh, I realize we're really tight on time now. Okay, 4 strategies really fast. Choices, granting students autonomy is super important. I think meaningful choices have been linked with performance, effort, intrinsic motivation. And so making sure those choices are meaningful for students. So they're not just choosing, which group to be in or where to sit in class, but they're making meaningful choices that actually impact their educational experience, what assignment to do, what essay prompt, that these choices are giving students autonomy and also providing opportunities for ownership and self-directed exploration. To affect competence, I think the way we give feedback is really important and can have tremendous motivational impact. A meta-analysis I did showed that positive feedback was more effective for increasing motivation and competence. But when giving negative feedback, if it's instructional and giving directions to improve, then it can kind of buffer some of the harmful effects of criticism. So let's give informational praise that highlights strengths, and let's give concrete and specific directions for improvement. Providing rationales, this is great to promote value into the task. Rationales have been shown to give students more engagement, to give them higher ratings of task value, and also influencing their performance. And so explaining why the material is useful for students' future goals, discussing why it's valuable to engage in this assignment, maybe even putting this language in syllabi, right? And integrating pro-social and communal goals in these rationales. As you give an assignment, why is it useful? Why is it important? How is this gonna influence maybe students' personal and communal goals? And last but not least, social belonging. A lot of the work done in this area has focused on mitigating the feelings of maybe I don't belong here, belonging uncertainty. At a selective institution, teaching students that challenges are common and improvable led to almost a 50% reduction in the achievement gap between socially, economically advantaged and disadvantaged students. And so emphasizing that, just because you're experiencing challenges and struggles, that doesn't mean you don't belong here, or share how belonging is hard, right? It's really hard at first, but it does improve over time, and really creating that kind of culture and climate where students feel like, okay, I don't belong at first, but I think it's going to get better. And I think I'll probably end it here. I do have 2 more studies, but I think I'll end it here. And then those slides, I think, will help kind of communicate that. There is an article that I sent to Amanda. I think she'll share that out, but it does include some reflective questions. And so it takes the model that I presented and gives questions to provide practical applications. And so it breaks down all the constructs and thinks about, okay, maybe think about these questions as you think about your instruction. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fong. We really appreciate your talk today. And I know the challenge of explaining motivation in such a short
Thank you.
such a short time period is very real. So we do have a couple of questions on the Slido
Sure.
that have been upvoted. So I'm going to start with one, but I'll also let the attendees know you can enter questions on the Slido. Or now that we'll probably have time for just a few questions, but if somebody has one that they want to read aloud, you can also use the raise hand feature. And if we have time, then I will I'll give you the floor so you can also ask Dr. Fong questions. The first question, I know that you were kind of getting toward the end of your talk, but
Yeah.
we were hoping that you can, I'll read the question here, but it says, with the complex constellation of factors influencing student motivation, what are some teaching strategies to create an environment that supports motivation? So I know that's a broad question, but if you could share maybe one or two just concrete teaching strategies that you think people could take away from this literature base as we move forward into our new reality.
Yeah, great, great tip, great question. And I wish I had more time to focus on the practical implications, but maybe to circle back. I mean, a lot of my work has focused on feedback, and so I think we give a lot of feedback. It's not the most enjoyable thing that instructors like to do. If in fact, I think research has shown that instructors dislike giving feedback and grading the most. And so, but I think that is such an important teaching opportunity. I think we kind of separate teaching and grading in our minds as instructors, but the more information you can give when giving feedback, feedback has been not only shown to be super important for learning, but it is critical for motivation. And it's tricky though, because really quickly you can demotivate students with a lot of negative critical feedback. And so it could really be like that fine distinction. And so I'll say this last bullet point, and I think it's more in the messaging, as you think about, okay, how is my feedback being perceived by the student? And I think if you spend time thinking about that, that's already going to change like a whole ton of how you approach giving feedback. But one thing that I have found is emphasizing high standards and a belief that students are capable to meet those standards. I think if that is infused within the feedback you give, I think that's going to be a really effective, motivating strategy. I would also say create as much as possible a mastery learning environment in your class. That's not concrete, I know, but I think there are concrete ways to show that. I think there are ways to de-emphasize competition and de-emphasize, aiming just for the high grade, but really showing that learning is the most valued activity, whether that's allowing students to redo assignments, because it's not about getting it right the first time, it's about learning, right? And I think those tweaks to maybe assignments and to teaching can foster motivation, but also going to a point that I had to skip is it fosters help seeking. Help seeking not only can improve students' competence, but when students feel like, okay, the emphasis is on mastery here, then help seeking isn't stigmatized, right? And I can actually go and seek what I like to call, what the research has called instrumental help seeking, right? Where you're going to learn versus maybe just get the answer and move on. And so really emphasizing, I think, a mastery approach, I think, in instruction is also a key takeaway.
Great, thank you so much. So we had one more question that I know we have time to get to, maybe just quickly, and then we'll probably have to wrap up. I went ahead and put this one in the chat, but it was how much of this generalizes to higher level students, so like master's or PhD students who might be kind of less focused on classroom learning, and more focused on other pursuits like engaging in research or being in the lab. So could you maybe give us a takeaway or two from this research for those students?
Yeah, that's really a good question, and there is an emerging amount of work on graduate student motivation. And I'll just do a plug for Nathan Hall at McGill, who's doing a lot of this work. But I think the same applies. I mean, a lot of especially advanced students in like the dissertating phase, like motivation is really challenging. So I think the supportive needs, I think, are really important to keep in mind. And I know for sure that work's been studied with doctoral students, where supporting their competence, because, hey, it's the first time they're doing a dissertation. They're probably not going to know the ropes to completing one. They're not going to feel a lot of relatedness, because they're probably isolated and kind of working independently on their research. And so trying to think about some of these psychological needs, I think, would be critical to support graduate students. So.
Great, thank you. So that is all of the time that we have today. We're at 2 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. I do want to remind attendees that we did record today's session. So we will be making the recording as well as Dr. Fong's slides available on our website, and we will email all of you to let you know when those are available and how you can access them. So thank you to Dr. Fong for coming and sharing your knowledge with us today. And thank you to everybody who came and attended.